There's an extremely important line here between pure healers and barrier healers on this screen right now. This line will almost certainly impact raid group composition, the skills that we'll see going into Endwalker, or even how you approach an expert roulette, and much more in the Endwalker expansion. The goal of this video is to explain the most likely place for each of the 4 healers on this line from pure to barrier healer. Hey guys, and welcome to my channel. As always, if you want to help support me and my content, I would incredibly appreciate if you threw a sage at that like button, new lists included, and cat daddied that subscribe button. So the cat daddy's out of the bag, and it is absolutely no secret. The Endwalker expansion is bringing up a significant shakeup to the healers, as was stated in the showcase. We do know that we're also going to be getting a brand new 4th healer called the Sage, as well as a reintroduction to the barrier versus pure healer metas, which is going to include the Ast toolkit being toolkitted basically from like its current stance, where you're like stance dancing between either nocturnal for barriers or diurnal for regenerative effects, to being more of a pure healer. So those are pretty huge changes. And so after this, after hearing about like this reintroduction of barrier versus pure healer metas, I really sat down and thought about it for a while. How could you actually balance 4 healers? How could you make it so that there were situations where you would want one healer or another one, or maybe certain combinations of them? And how could you give them a unique twist and spin? How could you twist it together? And then it kind of just pieced together in my mind, is this line right here is exactly how you would make that possible. So for me, I'm currently playing a lot of ranged DPS currently in my Savage raids, and when I pick a Bard versus a Dancer versus a Machinist, it's actually for extremely specific use cases, and it is actually very much not uncommon for me to, in a single night, swap between all 3. The explanation of that is way beyond the scope of this video, but the fact is that I have personally seen and experienced how 3 different jobs in the exact same role can be given specific strengths or a specific point or a specific purpose where, hey, maybe you really want to do that Dancer versus that Machinist. So I take that same idea and now I'm slamming it into the healers. So in the context of healers, it's really on this line. Which healer has what pros and what healer has what cons, and what pros and what cons really mix well together. Such as in a Savage raid static, who's going to provide mitigation? How much mitigation is needed for a particular raid boss? How much mitigation even makes it comfortable to do? Maybe you can survive it, but how much? How comfortable is that? Or how powerful is that tank buster? Would you need something like a recitation Adlo for the galvanize and catalyze the extremely powerful barrier of the Scholar? Would you need that? Or can you get away with less pure healing? Which healer brings a particular form of utility, such as Chain Stratagem or cards, or maybe some fringe utility ability like the Astrologian Sinistry, which allows them to heal 2 separate tanks at once, which is super fringe in most fights. Absolutely, I get what people are going to say in the comments. But where it is strong, Sinistry, just that one ability, is an absolute game changer. And I think that going into Endwalker with what I'm seeing now and what I'm predicting now, that those abilities are going to be very pivotal in what healer you'd bring to what fight. And that a big thing about being a Savage healer is going to be your ability to adapt and overcome your composition to these particular challenges. So there are a few more questions from this. Will the healer be more proactive? Will it be more reactive? Will it be a blend of both? And the more interesting question is, if it is a blend, how much does it blend? And sure, yes, we can make will it blend memes all day. I mean, preferably I would not be blending my Scholar tome, but in this context, what are we thinking that pure healing and barrier healing will look like in the Endwalker expansion? I want to just define what that might look like right now. I also say this because I know that we have a lot of WoW players or players coming from different games who might not be familiar with what the heck is this. And so likewise, I do want to explore this a little bit. So pure healing will include no abilities like damage mitigation. So you are not going to have the damage mitigation aspect of Temperance. You might have the healing boost, but you will not have the damage mitigation. Sacred Soil or different barriers like Adloquium, Nocturnal Sect, Aspected Benefic, or Divine Benison, all of those are completely out of the question. You're not going to be getting that proactive healing style where you're going to be deploying barriers, you're going to bring out Seraph, you're going to have Fey Illumination on the party, pop down a Sacred Soil and go to town. All of those, no. However, this prototype of Pure Healer will have extremely deep raw healing reserves, and just the throughput is going to be extremely large. At the core of its heart, it's going to be extremely reactive healing style. So instead of being proactive, so before the damage, doing all that setup I talked about before, you're going to wait for the damage to come out, then react to it. So essentially, the absolute prototypical Pure Healer is very similar to the White Mage right now, with potent reactive healing such as Planetary Indulgence with 3 Raptured Lilies, and then follow that up with a Size, and that's huge healing. Or let's take even Asylum, which people could argue is a proactive form of healing. It amplifies raw healing done, and it takes a heal over time on allies. But the thing about Asylum is its actual effect. You can place it ahead of time, and that is reactive. But the actual benefit you're getting from Asylum is inherently reactive. It is inherently helping you after the damage. Unless you're doing something interesting like synergy with like, oh, I'm going to place down Asylum that'll amplify your shields or something crazy like that. But let's also look at like the intensely deep healing of Benediction that the White Mage has, which is absolutely irreplaceable. And it makes handling something that is actually quite intimidating. I could say, for myself at least, it's kind of intimidating as a scholar, that the Dark Knight's Living Dead instant KO ability will kill them if you don't heal the equivalent to their maximum HP. It doesn't need to hit max HP, but you need to heal the equivalent of their max HP. And to me as a scholar, that is intimidating. But to a White Mage, they pop one cooldown. Boof. It's brilliant. Now, I will not talk much more about White Mage, because I think that we just did really well, but in my mind, there is no question that the White Mage is in its current form the very model of a modern major pure healer. So I'm plopping this Blood Lily monster down here on this left of this line, really far to the left of this line, because it is like the pure healer. Now comes the harder part to explain. Barrier healers. So pure barriers is something that I am going to posit we cannot see in its true form in current Final Fantasy XIV. In fact, Scholar is very distant from that ideal, as I'm going to explain very shortly. Inherently, a pure barrier healer would be a healer that would completely forsake all of its actual healing. Instead, maybe it would be more apt to call it a support, a pure barrier support. Opposed to healing, it would do raw damage mitigation and barriers that went on top of allies. This would include things like mitigation toolkits like damage mitigation portion of Collective Unconscious, damage mitigation of Sacred Soil, or the like ranged DPS have a 10% damage mitigation for the party. Simply put, all these skills do is that they reduce the damage intake, and that's huge actually in many raid situations. Now, it would also include barriers, which I do want to suss out this particular case and explore it a bit. Especially because I think that this is where it does get weird when you actually turn the looking glass and you look at barriers as we see them right now. It's like, it's one of those, once you notice, it kind of bugs you ever after kind of things. So with the examples, you're going to notice a key factor, because right now as we see barriers in the game, yes, the barrier component is what makes them distinct. Like when you talk about Adloquium from Scholar, you're talking about mostly the barrier. But they have a significant and often overlooked amount of healing underneath. Adlo heals for 300 potency, and that is rarely why someone's casting Adlo, and it makes the barrier equivalent to 125% of that, so a 375 potency shield. A pure barrier healer would not have that healing component. That's 300 potency of healing. That is not insignificant. Compare it to Physic, which is 400 potency of healing. Essentially, you are doing 3/4 of a Physic every time you're doing an Adlo. There is basically no reason why you would ever want to use Physic. Peace and love, respectfully. At least in my opinion. And actually, this same healing component to the barrier is the same for Sakor. Like, Seraph's Fairy Constellation ability, so like the big fairy uses an ability called Constellation. That AoE shield is primarily why I use her. She is extremely powerful for that. That is such a good ability. But where Seraph's very Seraphic Veil also brings a heal underneath the shield. Astrologian skills, even going from Scholar to Ast, those Ast skills that apply shields also have that same additional healing component, whether it's Nocturnal Aspected Benefit or Aspected Helios, Celestial Intersection or Celestial Opposition. There is going to be this healing component. So right now, in the current version of the game we're playing, the notion of a pure barrier healer, let alone a pure barrier skill, is extremely distant. The only pure barrier skill in this game is Divine Benison, which hilariously enough is in the White Mage's toolkit as a raw 500 potency barrier with no heal, which I think would... I'm gonna be honest, I think we would all be extremely hard pressed to not find any White Mage player say that this is a useful skill. It is extremely well taken up in the community, to understate it honestly. I'm not 100% sure when I say this, but I'm fairly sure that the developers probably have some usage metrics on the skill that they tracked before they actually began working on the Sage's toolkit, which would give them interesting data like how well would a pure heal skill, pure barrier skill work without any healing component. And that's information that is very valuable because, by definition, it is the only true in-combat barrier with no healing component, which is extremely different from old stone skin back in the day. This is in-combat barriers with no healing component that can be used on the fly. Very different skill. But the entire point that I want to make here is that barriers exist in the current state of the game with a heal component, save that one Divine Benison exception. This is extremely important because the notion of a pure barrier healer is one with no healing, otherwise it's not a pure barrier healer. Which I already know that most people picked up on it for sure, but this pure barrier support couldn't exist. It could not function in Final Fantasy XIV, such as how do you pick up an entire party's health bar when you have no healing? You can't, by definition. Unless, I'm thinking like an expert roulette even, unless you have perfect pre-planned barrier deployment and enough barriers from that, you will eventually have the party succumb to chip damage. Little chip damage will add up over time. Unless, of course, they use personal heals where possible, like Second Wind. So even an expert roulette with that idea becomes a big gamble. It's like, if you are even off the ball by a little bit, you will fall behind, and that eventually the party must wipe. So when people discuss the Sage as a pure barrier healer, that's not possible. Nor based on the footage that we've seen where, in my opinion and the opinion of most others that I've talked to, we've already seen the Sage's Cure 1 or Physic equivalent skill, which honestly I think most people agree on that one skill is very much that. Thus, even on the spectrum of far left pure healer to far right pure barrier support, Sage cannot even possibly be fully to the right of the spectrum. It doesn't make sense, it cannot function. So with all this information, where does that land us? Well, the Sage in its current form has been stated to be a unique case where it is a brand new job being added into the game, and that it is a barrier healer. I suppose that it is about as novel of information as everyone stating that grass is green, unless you are where I live, in which case it is brown and extremely sad grass. But from a higher level, like a design standpoint, the Sage is a brand new healer that allows the developers to change up the playing field with a brand new healer that forsakes even more raw healing for more barriers and mitigation. While we explored a pure healer is like a pure barrier support is impossible in the context of Final Fantasy, there is no reason why we couldn't take the current idea of Scholar and start refining pieces off, like no heal from Adlo, no fairy, no excog, and then arrive at a more barrier-oriented healer. For the sake of this video though, I will preemptively place the Sage extremely far on the right of this line. And the thing is though, not fully to the right, because by definition, as we explored before, we cannot have a functional support without healings, hence the healing role. And now people might be bothered when they see this line going why is this a thing? Why is there this big middle section of doom? Since I have now established the two furthest sides with White Mage on one, Sage on the other. So that brings us to now talking about Scholar. So the Scholar has always had Eos and Selene in their kit, even during the glorious days of A Realm Reborn. If I keep reminiscing about that, people are going to call me a 14 boomer or something like that. But as Eos and Selene, even back then, were basically heal bots. You could macro them, there was so much that you could do, but out of the context of this video. As we Scholars could do other tasks in the group, like being an Affliction Warlock, we could micromanage those fairy heals with macros. It was significant portions of healing. The fairy has always been and is still a cornerstone of the Scholar toolkit, and it is impossible, if I'm being honest, impossible for me to imagine Scholar losing the fairy without completely snapping the entire Scholar philosophy in half. You would completely destroy what really made the Scholar unique in the spectrum of all healers. Even in this expansion, where we lost parallel fairy action control with macros to focus target tanks with fairy embrace, or being able to cast fairy abilities mid-cast of resurrection like Whispering Dawn, the fairy is still absolutely a cornerstone of our kit, and provides a ton of healing. In fact, this expansion, we have now seen the fairy kit be shoved even further into the pure healer direction. We have mandatory Whispering Dawn, mandatory Fey Illumination, and I say that because RIP Celine. We have Fey Blessing, we have Fey Union, and these are all pure healing abilities. Seraph Constellation or Seraphic Embrace also have healing components, even if they are primarily valued as shields. They are definitely big heals. Scholar also has an extremely potent area of effect healing through Indom, which, when it's paired with Recitation, is an absolutely bizarre amount of instant party-wide healing, or one of the most unique, in my opinion, most Scholar prototypical additions to the kit was in XCOG and Stormblood, when you got a reactive healing buff that you'd place on an ally where if their HP drops below 50%, it bursts them back up with 800 potency of healing. The proactive nature of that buff it lends itself so beautifully to the Scholar's kit, rewarding planning and cooldown management before things happen to reward you, and with big payoff at the end if you do it properly. And that isn't even reiterating that Adlo, Seraphic Veil, Constellation, Succor, the Scholar's barrier abilities, all of those have a baseline heal in all of those very same skills. So when people propose that the Scholar is the very model of a modern major barrier healer, I feel that that's completely untrue. It has never been true, even during A Realm Reborn. Even just the Fairy Auto in A Realm Reborn has always been considered extremely solid raw healing value. Even today with it, in my opinion, and many others actually, like people crunch the numbers, like the lower healing potency of like the Embrace of Eos is still such good value. But to think that for a class that has always had this aspect, it would suddenly have the fairy snuffed out, or like these other abilities, it doesn't really make sense. But I would actually be genuinely shocked if suddenly after all these literal years we see the Scholar lose their fairy. So what that leaves us at is that the Scholar on this line from pure to barrier healer is significantly closer to the middle dividing line than the upcoming Sage. The Scholar is a barrier healer. It has always been a powerful barrier healer with Adlo, deployment tactics, let alone the Seraph Fairy toolkit or damage mitigation like Fey Illumination, Sacred Soil. But it is extremely far from being a slouch in the raw healing department. Even before more recent Stormblood, Heavensward, and Shadowbringers editions, it was still not a slouch. So I actually do place him closer to the middle of the pure healer to barrier healer side. Now let's talk about Astrologian, and this is going to surprise probably no one, especially since the line is on the screen right now, but before I go into it, I may as well drag this Ast onto the bar between White Mage and dividing line between pure and barrier healer. It's going to be closer to being a barrier healer than White Mage for sure. And I'm also going to put this here in particular because in the Endwalker showcase, Astro was specifically stated to have their toolkit being reworked for them to be more of a pure healer than their current iteration, much to the dismay of Noct Ast lovers like me. But I am slightly optimistic, okay, very optimistic, that Sage is going to make up for these bad feelies in spades. But enough of that, let's focus specifically on Diurnal's stance of Ast. We are not looking at Nocturnal Ast, we're looking at Diurnal, so this is the regen, the more quote-unquote white mage stance of Ast, which is probably the best representation of what we will see in the upcoming Endwalker expansion with the retooling. Without any question, we have an extremely powerful healing toolkit, with things like Earthly Star, Horoscope, Sinistry, and Sinistry in the right context is bizarrely powerful. We have Celestial Opposition, which is very strong. The toolkit of an Ast is absolutely no slouch in the raw healing department. Completely not a slouch at all. It's very strong. And with it being a pure healer next expansion, it is about as surprising as my undying love of pizza. But what is fascinating to me is that even in Diurnal regen stance, is that the Ast still has access to that deep healing, but mitigation and barrier options, which is very, very unique and very Ast, because when you talk about Ast, you're always thinking, oh, you have like the sun, you have the moon, you have the nocturnal, you have the diurnal. It's very much that. And so Collective Unconscious is what I want to bring up right now. And that is a tooltip that makes even the most veteran of players quiver in fear. It is a lot of text. But basically in this, the diurnal stance will apply immediately a heal over time effect onto all allies caught into it. And the secondary effect is that the Ast will deploy a barrier, a blue barrier around themselves that will reduce damage taken by allies standing in that barrier by 10%, so long as the Ast doesn't move. And if you move, the barrier goes away and yeah, you just get the heal. But which is nice because sometimes I just want the hot and I don't really care about the mitigation. But if you have the mitigation, you still have that mitigation option and it is very powerful. But regardless, we can see how even in regen stance, that the Ast literally has a raw damage mitigation ability regardless, which is super cool. Celestial Intersection also is a very cool skill because it provides a small heal, but a very solid shield on the target that you can weave in off of the global cooldown, which is access to a Parafor barrier on demand. Just to reiterate, this barrier does have a heal component to it, unlike Divine Benison, which makes sense when you think about, hey, like the Ast is a pure healer, but it still has a little bit of barrier in it. Definitely a homage to the past Ast stance. So now I want to get into probably the most unique skill that makes me feel the way that I do about Ast right now going into Endwalker, which is Neutral Sect. This ability allows the Ast to apply both the regen and the barrier bonuses to all of their aspected skills, meaning that the Ast in regen stance can temporarily dip into the ability to mass deploy barriers with aspected Helios, which is bizarrely powerful. Like if you combine this with light speed and you spam that, it is bizarrely powerful. So all of these 3 unique examples in the Ast kit might seem like cherry picking a few examples because I realized, like, is this like 10 skills on it? No. But the Ast, even in regen stance, has always been able to be involved in barriers, even if it is raw healing powerful. And that, alongside the card system, is really their unique factor. It's their flavor, it's that adaptability. And I don't really see a world where even a reworked Ast doesn't have barrier access. It has just been a part of their kit. That adaptability has been a cornerstone. And given the current state of their regen kit, having mitigation and barrier options, I can't see a world where that's just thrown away. It might be changed, like maybe you don't see the 20% healing amplification on top of the ability to also cast barriers on top of your regens, but it is going to be, in my opinion, definitely there in Endwalker in some form. And hence why I'd place the Ast very comfortably on the middle left of the spectrum in Endwalker. It's not as far as White Mage, but it is definitely there, and it's definitely getting close to that barrier healing. It's just a little bit. You're getting a little bit of barriers, a lot of healing. And so that's how that blends. The Ast blends. So let's close off with a wrap-up summary. So the White Mage will be the most pure healer of them all, the fairest of them all, with extremely deep healing reserves like the Lily system, which goes into Planetary Indulgence, with extremely iconic abilities like Benediction that can literally recover a Dark Knight from Living Dead, which to me is like the epitome of like burst healing. Is that terrible to say? I'm so sorry. But we then have Astrologian being less of a pure healer and dipping its toes in with limited barrier and mitigation options. Like even right now, Diurnal Stance Ast, the Healing Stance Ast, has extremely powerful barrier deployment and mitigation options. Even if they are limited, they are so strong. Scholar will likely give up significant portions of their current healing toolkit in Endwalker, in my opinion. I, to be quite frank, cannot see a balanced and fair world where the current state of Scholar's healing is allowed to go forward in a barrier healer versus pure healer world myself. I'd actually be genuinely surprised just because it is so much healing. But regardless, the Scholar, with their extremely potent mitigation and barrier toolkit, has always had ample emergency tools with the very backup support healing, which has never been trivial healing, even in A Realm Reborn. Without breaking the fairy, the Scholar just cannot fit the prototypical modern Major General of a barrier healer prototype. And like I brought up before, even Adloquium, the skill that you think of when you think about like deploying a barrier, especially for me who's been playing since A Realm Reborn, like that is the skill I think of. That has 300 potency heal component to it. The Scholar's barriers in and of themselves have a significant healing component, and it's never just been barriers. Now, the Sage is throwing everything for a loop, and really what made this line clear in my mind. The Sage, being a brand new healer, allows the developers to completely change out the playing field with a brand new healer that forsakes even more raw healing for more barriers and more mitigation. While we explored that a pure barrier healer is impossible in the context of Final Fantasy, there is no reason why we couldn't take the current idea of Scholar and start refining pieces of it, like no heal from Adlo, no fairy, no Excog, and then we could arrive at a more barrier-oriented healer. As always, I am genuinely curious about your thoughts, and I will be checking the comments in the video. Like, let me know what your thoughts are. After all, I am just one person, and these are my thoughts on my personal analysis of what we're likely to see. But of course, I am extremely hungry for more speculation and theories, so let me know yours. Anyhow, that is all for this video. I hope everyone is taking care and having an excellent day.